share my screen. Just tell me if you can see it. I'm more used to using Teams than I am to. Is it full screen for you or not?
No, we can see PowerPoint.
How about now?
It's full screen. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So just as a bit of a short one, really. So I'll kind of go through the R&D process and how we tend to work with new products, and how this specific product works. And then we can go into some Q&A. So we kind of have two streams to our R&D, and one of those is developing products in-house, so within our own in-house R&D team. But we're quite a small team in brewing. There's probably about 50 of us worldwide in brewing, I think. So it's not massive, and obviously then your R&D capability is somewhat restricted. So we do some things in-house, and everything we subsequently do, we follow up with in-house. But we also work with partners in universities and research stations. So the Philly Sour specifically was designed in collaboration with a research university in Philadelphia, called the University of the Sciences, Philadelphia, and they have a yeast wrangling program. So this is a product that was kind of the product of their yeast wrangling program. They came to us and said, we think we've got this really exciting strain. We'd like you to test it with your own in-house methods and see if you agree. And then if you like it and your customers like it, do you think you'd like to license it from us? And we said, oh, maybe, and took it in-house and gave it a go. So we already had all of their results to go on, which were that it was a very interesting species of Lactantia, which unusually for a Lactantia species actually ferments work sugars quite well. So species like Lactantia, they're wild yeast, so they tend to exist in the environment on natural sugars, so like plants basically. And this particular strain was found on a tree in they call it a graveyard, but essentially it's a very large botanic garden with some graves in it here in Philadelphia. And they did lots of yeast wrangling around this park, and this is one of the strains that they managed to come up with. I think they did probably hundreds of different strains, and it's quite rare for a strain in the natural environment to ferment maltose and maltotriose, which are your main sugars in your brewery fermentation. So they immediately knew they were kind of onto something, and that's when they kind of approached us to talk about it. So what they said to us was it can do full attenuation, so it can ferment the maltotriose, maltose and glucose. It can give a full attenuation, so somewhere in the range of 80%. And at the same time, it produces acidity, so you can get your acidity down to pH 3.2, and a reasonable degree of titratable acidity as well, so between 0.1 and 0.4, which is where you really want to be for a sour beer. Kind of compares quite nicely with a kettle sour produced using our sour pitch bacteria. So quite a unique thing in that it's a yeast that produces acidity and can be used for brewing fermentation, and kind of a nice quiver in our bow as well, because it is not a bacteria. So, we already have 2 bacteria within the range, and this is something new that we can add, and it's quite commercially, it's quite a good idea, particularly on the commercial side, rather than home brewing, because commercial brewing, tying up your kettle for 48 to 72 hours to do kettle souring is a bit of a concern. You're probably less worried about that at the home scale. But at the larger scale, that becomes quite annoying quite fast. So this is like a new solution which sort of solves that problem. But just to give you an idea of the initial kind of lab fermentations, we have this to start with. We've got gravity in blue and pH in orange. And you can see you get this quite slow sort of initial period with the fermentation. And at the same time, you get a fairly rapid reduction in pH. And that's because these organisms, and actually same with bacteria as well, they only actually produce lactic acid from glucose. So at the start of your fermentation, when you kick off, you've probably got between 10 and 15% glucose there. And that glucose is what the strain will use and create lactic acid. But in doing that, it will ignore the maltose and the maltotriose that are also present within solution. So it's actually kind of in the same way as a regular brewing yeast, and that a regular brewing yeast will start with the most simple sugars first, and then it will start fermenting the more complex ones as it goes on. So this takes in the glucose to start with, creates a bit of lactic acid, drops the pH, and then following this, it starts eating into the maltose and the maltotriose, and you see a kind of a more kind of normal fermentation after the first day. So you get this sort of like, we call it biphasic, but you get this sort of elongated lag phase where if you were like just looking at a regular brewing fermentation, you think that nothing was happening. But if you follow the pH, and you'll see that that drops quite rapidly. So you know something's happening. You don't necessarily see a reduction in pH. You can see here as well that the fermentation time is quite long. Genetic brewing yeasts have obviously been selected for over many, many years to efficiently assimilate wort sugars. And in this, you can see that standard brewing temperature is taking quite a long time. And we'll go into that as we go on because there's more data. This is lab data. Profile, if you're going to go with a malt forward beer, it's more of a kind of a red appley kind of appley flavor on the nose. We find that if you dose the fermentation with glucose, you get a bit more of a peach character as well. We'll go into glucose because that's kind of an interesting characteristic of this strain as well. And you can see here what happens if you add that kind of enrichment of glucose. On the left-hand side, this is just a fermentation curve, and really like it's finishing about the same amount of time. You see a slightly faster fermentation without the glucose, but they finish in about the same place, so it doesn't affect your overall attenuation too much. But on the right-hand side, this is just looking at pH over the course of the fermentation. You can see in orange, which is the fermentation that's had the glucose added to it, you get much more acid production, and we're measuring pH there, so the difference doesn't look that great. But if you measure titration acidity, it would look even greater. So just adding a bit of glucose into the fermentation, if you want a greater amount of acidity, can make quite a lot of difference. Again, looking at this, you can see that it's quite a long fermentation. So we've got probably about, I think that's 240 hours thereabouts to reach full attenuation. So 10 days, which to be honest, in a commercial brewery, that's getting to the point where that's almost unacceptable. So quite long in lab fermentation data. Just some quick facts. One of the things that make it probably quite attractive is you don't need to pre-sour your wort. So quite often if you're doing a kettle sour, people like to pre-sour the wort. That's just stop it going off. But because you're boiling, you're killing everything in it, and then you're going forward to fermentation, you don't need to do that. You also, if you're using bacteria, can't use hops. But in this case, it's a yeast, and it's not sensitive to hops in the slightest. So you can wort hop as normal. Appreciate you making a sour beer, you probably don't want it to be too high in bitterness because it just doesn't work having a really bitter sour beer. And then a little bit of facts on kind of like the yeast strain itself, and kind of some of the things that we look out for with wild yeasts, which are killer negative, which means that it won't outcompete other strains. So quite often some of your wine strains and some of your champagne strains tend to secrete what we call a killer protein into the wort, and that one actually it doesn't kill strains directly, but it outcompetes them, so it makes them less efficient at utilizing the sugar. So you don't get problems with this strain outcompeting brewing strains in your brewery. So if you're worried about it, and you're worried about it kind of taking over fermentations, you needn't be, because it's killer negative and it's not a very robust strain. It's also POF negative, which is a flavor we call phenolic off flavor, so POF, phenolic off flavor, and that tends to be quite common in wild yeast strains as well. It's actually a yeast defense mechanism, so it creates this flavor when it's protecting itself from some chemicals within plant cell walls that would act to kind of disrupt the growth of the yeast cells. So it's POF negative, which is also quite rare in wild yeast and quite useful from a brewing perspective as well, because it's only really a positive attribute in Belgian beers. And then it grows in all your standard wild yeast media. So if you were trying to pick it up in one of your standard fermentations, you'd be able to do so very easily. So that's some of the lab data. When we launch strains, what we tend to do is we do this sort of initial kind of R&D phase in-house and in the university. And then because things always behave differently in the real world compared with lab fermentations, we ship them out to breweries worldwide. So most of the trials that were done with Philly Sour were done in the States. But on the back of those, you get further information and more data on how the strain would behave in a commercial environment. So this is just to give you an idea of some of the things that are done with some of the breweries, all different kind of pitch rates, attenuation levels, mash temperatures, starting pHs and fermentation temperatures. So you kind of have to sort through all the data and kind of get a good average while taking into account some of the things that might give you real kind of outliers. But we came to a sort of average down at the bottom there of the trials that I've shown here, and that shows a fermentation time of about 10 days and an attenuation of about 75 apparent, which is pretty normal for a brewing yeast strain, and very, very good for a wild yeast strain. pH is starting, I mean, that's just how you're making your wort in your brewery, but your ending pH 3.4, which is about where we want it to be, and the total transferable acidity of 12.8, which is a decent high level. As I say, things tend to perform differently in commercial settings than they do in the lab, and one of the things that we found particularly was fermentation temperature. So we initially, when we started out, I think we said 22 to 25 degrees for this yeast, and having spoken to quite a few commercial breweries in the UK on how it's been for them, if you go in low, like less than 22 degrees, it's just too slow to be viable within the brewery. It doesn't perform quickly enough. It does do the souring, it does eventually finish, but you're probably talking somewhere like 15 to 20 days, which is just far too long. So these days, when I have breweries approach me about this particular strain and ask for temperature recommendations, I've upped my own guidelines from 22 up towards 25 to 27, and it seems to work quite nicely there. You probably see fermentation about 7 days in that time, which is more acceptable. You can see this is just from the initial trial data, this scatter graph that you've got here, and you can see that the higher temperatures you get a faster fermentation time, but over time, with the amount of data that we've come in from commercial trials in the industry, we see that pattern is a lot more pronounced, and you could probably put a line of best fit on it quite nicely, whereas from the data there you could, but there's not that many data points to go on. So yeah, I'd definitely pitch it on the warm side. So as I've mentioned, some of the regular kind of fermentations that were done with it, they seem to struggle a little bit with low temperatures, but also with high mash temperatures. And that's probably, again, because the strain is not as well suited to fermenting multitriers as genetic brewing yeast would be. So whilst it does have the capability to do so, which again is rare in a wild strain, it's not as strong a multitriers fermenter as a brewing yeast would be. So it's more affected by high mash temperatures than, say, like Nottingham would be, where it doesn't really care if it's multitriers or maltos that will happily gobble up the lot. This would start to get a bit grumpy if you've got loads and loads of multitriers there. So we recommend higher fermentation temperatures and lower mash temperatures as well. This is just a little bit of a mention on fruit and how that kind of affects it, and how the timing of that fruit addition would affect it. So one of the questions I get most actually when making sour beer is where should I add the fruit content? And fruit purees, fruit juices, they tend to be made up of very simple sugars, so like fructose, glucose, and others. And you can add them at the start and you'll get some acidity from it. The Philly sour can actually, it can metabolize fructose into lactic acid. So you can do it at the start if you want some lactic acid from it. But the problem with that is you tend to lose quite a lot of the fruity aromas that you would expect in a fruit-based sour beer, because they basically boil off. So they're very volatile. And if you add them at the start, you lose them throughout the fermentation. So what I say to people is that you should add them towards the end of fermentation, but not at the end of fermentation. So if you add them towards the end of fermentation, they contribute to alcohol rather than lactic acid, and you don't lose so much of that fruity flavour in the fermentation. So that's where I would add the fruit. You do occasionally get people where they'll contact you and they'll ask you, I've got a fermentation, I waited it for it to finish, and then I added fruit puree to it, and now it's not doing anything, and you go, oh, that doesn't sound good. Don't put that in a can anytime soon. So avoid doing that. If you have done that, I'd probably recommend that you add something that's a little bit more vigorous than the Philly sour, just to mop it up. So Philly sour, I'm sure, would do it given enough time, but you're probably quicker to add either a wine yeast that will smash out the simple sugars quite easily, like a champagne strain, or even a robust brewing strain, which will also quite happily ferment simple sugars like that as well. So fruit is good, and I think most people like to put fruit in their sour beers these days, but I would be probably keen to put it in the in midway for fermentation or towards the end of fermentation, and definitely not at the end. No reports of any kind of inhibition from adding fruit. So occasionally you do get people that suggest that they've added fruit and everything stopped because the yeast has switched into fermenting the simple sugars and is now leaving the more complex brewing sugars behind. But we've not seen anything with that. The only other thing you might need to watch with purees and stuff is quite often they have quite high sulfur content, which is used as a preservative and will actually act on yeast as well. So if you ever add a puree, just make sure that it doesn't have a very high SO2, likely to slow down your fermentation and kill your yeast that way. So we've also done some tests using lactose. So there's some commercial breweries out there looking at lactose, so putting lactose in the fermentation to sweeten it. And this is kind of like, I mean, it's data that, you know, probably telling people stuff that they already know, but if you add lactose, you get a lower apparent attenuation, and that's because it doesn't ferment. So stick lactose in, it doesn't change it, it doesn't ferment lactose. You will end up with a lower attenuation. And again, that's a question that I get quite a lot. Does it ferment lactose? Because people like to use lactose to sweeten their sour beers. Lactose fermentation is actually pretty unusual in yeast. So there's only really one genera I think does it well, and that's Cloveromyces. There's a few strains that have been commercialized for wine, but none that I know of that are like used regularly. Maybe in cheese making, that sort of thing. But it's not a characteristic of any yeast that you'll tend to find for alcoholic fermentation, with a caveat that some people in bits of the Balkans and kind of like the Eurasian steppe and stuff sometimes do milk fermentation. So they'll probably be using Cleveromyces for things either deliberately or in a wild kind of format. But most brewing yeast and most wine yeasts don't ferment lactose. Looking at dextrose addition, so this is for your lactic acid at the start. So if you're adding a large amount of dextrose, what you'll find is that you will end up with a higher acidity and therefore a lower pH. But if you add quite a lot, you'll start to see quite high apparent attenuations as well. And that's just because you're adding something that's more or less 100% fermental into the mix. So it probably isn't all going to go into lactic acid production. Some of it will go into alcohol production. And then you'll get the double whammy of alcohol being less dense than beer, wort, or water, and having a very fermentable extract there. So you'll see a high attenuation based on those two factors. So as your alcohol content goes up because you've got a very fermentable extract there, your density will drop because the alcohol is less dense than the water. And we did look at some, I don't have any graphs on this, but we looked at some secondary yeast additions. So quite a lot of people these days like to do kind of blended fermentations, so a co-pitch, so to speak, so where you add a different yeast at the same time or later on in the process as Philly Sour. And this is where we looked at some fermentations where you would either add the yeast at the start or halfway through. And what you find is that because the Philly is quite a slow yeast compared with the brewing yeast, if you add a very vigorous ale yeast right at the start at the same time with Philly Sour, it will tend to outcompete the Philly Sour for the glucose. So you won't see as much souring as you ordinarily would, because that brewing yeast has gobbled up all the glucose that the Philly Sour needs to create lactic acid. So you'll probably find that it ferments quite well, but it won't produce a very good sour beer. So what we recommend is that you do, we call it, I've forgotten the name. It's terrible. I'll remember at some point and I'll tell you, but basically you pitch it later in the process. So you wait a day and then you add the secondary strain if that's what you want to do. So if you wanted to make a really dry sour beer, maybe using like a saison yeast, you would do it like that. So you wait until the lag phase was over and the strain kicked into regular alcoholic fermentation, and then you would add the brewing strain. And I remembered it's sequential inoculation, that's what we call it. And then finally, we just have a little bit of data on alternative fermentations. So a few people that want to try out kind of hard seltzer and mead and that sort of thing using the Philly Sour. You find it, you can. The kind of interesting fermentations to run. So honey and cane sugar fermentations aren't very easy to do, just purely on the basis of the fact that a sugar-based fermentation has a very low level of nutrient. You need a certain amount of nitrogen for yeast growth so that it can create the proteins that it needs to digest the sugars that are present within the substrate that you're fermenting. And if you use just honey or just sugar, there's more or less nothing there. So you'll find if you just put yeast and sugar in water, you'll probably see a short fermentation and then it'll pretty much stall out. So if you want to get an efficient mead or hard seltzer fermentation using the filler, you can, and it will actually reduce the pH as well. But you need to use quite a large amount of nutrient. In this particular study, they've used a product called Yeast Life O, which is a product that we make for hard seltzer fermentations, and it works pretty well. It's basically just a nitrogen source with vitamins, minerals, and a lot of the nitrogen comes from autolyzed yeast, so it's an organic nitrogen source. Interestingly, the pH is quite low, but what you find with these sugar fermentations is the pH is quite low anyway. So because there's no wort there, and wort has a very high buffering capacity, and it tends to buffer the pH a bit higher than just a sugar fermentation would, you have to ask the question, is that pH low just because it would be anyway, or is that pH low because the strain has created a lot of lactic acid? And I don't have that data here, and I'd quite like to see it. Right, that's a very short intro to the Philly Sour, but I thought it'd be good to kind of stick with the kind of the questions and answers format, really, because that's where the good stuff comes out. So I'm opening the floor. If anybody wants to speak to me or ask me questions, please do.
Thanks, Andy. That was really interesting. One of the things that I've seen is a bit of debate about is the pitch rates on this. It seems that I think originally there was one pitch rate recommended, and then seemed like it was almost doubled. Have you got any further information on that?
Yeah, I think for memory it's 1 gram per litre, which is probably on the high end for our regular brewing strains. Probably where it's changed in the advice, I think, is for like stronger fermentation. So if you're going in with like a high alcohol content, it's probably beneficial to go in higher just to have a fermentation that's not unreasonably long. So that would probably be the difference. We always end up having to adjust things slightly after we launch. So, you know, you get the commercial data back and it probably differs slightly from what happened in the lab. Probably the biggest example of that I can think of is the New England strain that we launched about probably 4 years ago now. So it was just when I joined the company and they launched the New England strain. The pitching rate they used then was the same as our standard ale strains. I think they went with like 0.5 to 1 grams per hectoliter. Grams per liter. And in reality, that strain requires a bigger pitch rate to work well. So it does often change after launch, and then you have to adjust all the internal documents and try and make everything kind of coherent with what actually happens in reality. So it probably did change, and I think that's probably for the stronger beers mostly. And the temperature recommendations certainly did change.
I've got a question here, Andy, from one of our gang who couldn't make it tonight, who had used Philly Sour. In fact, he had only just finished a Philly Sour brew, and he had a couple of questions. The first was, he fermented 25 degrees, but he developed an infection during the souring phase, and he said before primary fermentation kicked in. So yeah, I'm interested to see how that fits in with how you've described the fermentation. But he said, apart from proper sanitation, is there a way to mitigate that risk, or should the souring kill off any competing bugs?
Interesting. Do you know what sort of contamination it was? That would be the
Good question. I don't know.
No, I mean, other than good sanitation, it's a pretty tricky one, really, because I mean, you could lower the pH, but that would sort of negate the point in using the Philly Sour in the first place. So not really. If he's had a contamination at that stage, bearing in mind that the pH drops quite quickly anyway, it's likely to be in a wild yeast infection. So I don't know if it was or it wasn't, but that would be my go-to. You know, if you had a fermentation go right at the start like that,
Yeah.
during a slow period, it's likely to be probably a pitchier or something like that.
Yeah.
And other than good sanitation and keeping it completely closed, not much more you can do really.
Yeah. I mean, I think he's sort of half guessed that maybe that was it, given the way he worded the question. But okay, that's cool. And then he went on to say the pH only got to 3.8. The wort started at 5.1. Is there a way to ensure hitting 3.5 quickly?
I'd probably suggest in that case using a bit of glucose, because it does depend on your wort substrate. How much acid that you produce.
Yeah.
So if he's mashed slightly on the warmer side, or he's used malts that don't have a great deal of kind of simple sugars in them at the start, then it can affect the amount of sourness. Also worth looking at water profile, because if you're using quite alkaline water, it will tend to resist a change in pH quite nicely. So it could be that the pH is quite high, but the acidity level is more what you'd expect. The effect can be quite pronounced. So you can actually see a beer that's at 3.6 pH, but actually the titrated acidity is quite high, and it's just the buffering capacity of the wort that has prevented it from dropping further. So yeah, I would start maybe with a bit of glucose and dropping the mash temperature, but then I'd probably look at the water if that didn't make any difference.
Okay, great.
With regard to the infection that was referred to, I have been chatting with Steve about it, and he said it was a chlorophenol taste.
Okay. So kind of I mean that could be water as well, chlorophenol. So it depends really what he's using with his water. If you're getting phenol characteristics from a beer and it's not chlorophenol, but it's more kind of a medicinal type characteristic, that's more likely to be a wild yeast. So I've had commercial fermentations that didn't take off. One particular incident when somebody pitched the yeast and didn't have the cold water running to the heat exchanger, so they pitched their yeast into 80-degree wort. That got an infection, and that was very pronounced on the sort of TCP kind of medicinal side of things. So it sounds to me like it's probably a wild yeast infection.
Do you have any experience of using it with co-pitching, perhaps, in making a stout to get that old school tang that you get in foreign export type stouts sometimes?
So I don't, but I think you're onto something there. Actually, I have a good mate that works for Guinness at St James's Gate, and he shared with me the process, although he probably isn't supposed to. But they actually do create a sour beer, and they blend that into the Guinness mix. So they produce a sour beer, a dark malt extract, and a pale ale, and they blend those three to make the Guinness. So I think there's definitely scope for that, because they are using a brew that's got quite a high quantity of lactic acid in it to get that tang. So it's the same acid. So I don't see why you couldn't use the Philly Sour for the same purpose.
So you could perhaps co-pitch it with a fairly neutral ale yeast. So if you were going to co-pitch it, you talked about pitching about halfway through. I'm just wondering, rather than doing the whole blending thing, whether you could actually manipulate the yeasts to give you enough of a tang with an ale yeast. Do it the other way around.
I don't see why not. You'd probably have to be a bit careful about getting your timings right, so that it didn't end up just being a sour stout. But if you manage to kind of catch it at the right moment and then add the ale yeast into the fermentation, I don't see why you couldn't kind of work that in as a method. It might be trickier, it might be harder than blending, but it is certainly a possibility. I mean, if you can do a dry stout like Guinness, I'd probably go with Nottingham, just because it's got a very high level of attenuation and it's quite neutral in character. So that's probably what I'd go for. But no, give it a try and let me know how it goes, because it's a good idea.
Yeah, because I've seen a lot of historical records, primary brewing sources, and it was noticeable in the first portion of the 20th century, late 19th century, that they usually reported the acidity of the stouts. So it obviously was a thing, because later on they changed their processes somehow, perhaps not adding Brettanomyces and other factors, to make them less sour, therefore sweeter. So yeah, I've got some Philly sour. I have to say I'm not a huge sour beer fan. But I was interested to see whether I could use it in a different way.
To be honest, you'd be the first person that I know of that's tried that. So if you do it, I'd be fascinated. I think it's
Right, well,
a good show.
I'll stick it on the list. I'm not sure whether it comes before mash hopping or after, or perhaps with.
Why not?
Yeah, this idea you should only change one variable at a time is fairly boring.
I think so.
Life's too short. Just hopping on the back of that, Andy, with Nottingham, at what point you mentioned it being, well, perhaps insensitive is the wrong word, but at what point does it become sensitive to temperature of the mash? Like, where would you start expecting to see attenuation drop off in terms of mash temperature?
So probably in the region of about 68, to be honest, is where I think your fermentability is going to start dropping. One of the things that I've worked on within Lallemand is it's not actually related to what we're talking about today. Is everybody still there, by the way? Can you hear me? Yeah, they just all kind of froze your pictures, and I was worried. Is low alcohol beer production. So it looks quite in depth at high temperature mashing and how you can limit fermentability by doing that. So what you'll find is that as you start to raise your mash temperature, you start to kill off the beta amylase enzyme, which is responsible for producing maltose, which is the main fermentable sugar in a brewing fermentation. So as your temperature rises, that happens quite quickly, but you still get some alpha amylase activity. So you'll get some starch breakdown all the way up into the reasonably high 70s actually, but you'll see your beta amylase drop off quite quickly. So if you're getting up to probably like 70, you'll see your beta amylase stop working efficiently for kind of a standard strength beer, probably even lower than that. So I see quite a lot of breweries where they'll send me an email and say, oh, my fermentation's stunted, and they've been mashing it at 69, and they're right on the level there, they're right on the limit. And if there's a fluctuation in the mashing in water, or the malts change slightly and the diaspatic is a little bit lower, then they're kind of right on the teetering on the edge of where it could cause a problem. So it does work as a way to kind of get those full-bodied kind of New England IPAs and stuff, but you do have to be a little bit aware of the fact that if you get it slightly wrong, you are kind of flying by the seat of your pants, and it could go wrong quite easily.
Okay, yeah.
Have you got a new background piece there? I can't tell. Almost looks like a fermenter. Is it?
That's Wadworth.
Okay.
Better timestamp it. That's 2007-ish, something like that. I don't know whether they've enclosed their fermenters now or not.
Probably not. I wouldn't think. I hear rumours that they're kind of hanging on. They're not doing too well, but they're hanging on.
Yeah,
they're apparently they're moving to a new brewery. I can't quite remember where it is, but I think the Northgate's become too small. Some issue, and I think there's been a bit of a hoo-ha around it locally. That it's quite a while since I heard it. I think if I was still living in my hometown, it'd be my local brewery. Local big brewery anyway. So
it's Devices, right?
that's right. Yeah.
It's another salutary tale that if you want to check out a brewery, you need to go on the brewery tour. And if you've not done Hook Norton, that is an absolutely classic brewery tour, simply because of the kit that they've still got in place. So yeah, I do like brewery tours, but once you've seen a room full of shiny stainless steel, you've seen them all, really. You need to see the more historic ones, I reckon.
Agreed. I've got Harvey's on my doorstep, so I'm a bit spoiled.
Yeah, I've done the Harvey's one I think 3 times. Not recently, because I think the waiting list's pretty long for that one.
Yeah, you need an in.
I was going to say that it's one of the tours I would love to do, and these people who've done multiple tours of Harvey's, absolute bastards. Terrible.
This was quite a few years ago when it wasn't quite the
Not
thing.
an excuse. Not an excuse.
Talking about brewery tours, on Saturday I went to the Brewery Heritage Centre, which is now run by Sandbrooks, which is now located in the old Young's Brewery. And John Hatch is the guy who's an ex-Young's brewer. He was tasked with maintaining a nano brewery on the site through the development, and he gave the tour, and it's absolutely fascinating. He's a mine of information. He's the sort of guy you want to sit down with a pint or two, and he could tell you all sorts of amusing tales and stories. It was really, really good. And for those guys in London and the Southeast, I thoroughly recommend it. Only £15. You get samples as well, and you can sit in the Sandbrooks tap room afterwards and have a good time. Really, really worthwhile.
Well, thanks for that.
There's quite a good, it's almost like an archival film they did where they interviewed all the old young staff. I'll see if I can dig it up and stick it on the stream. They sort of talk about, the brewing history at the brewery from all sorts of perspectives.
I'd like to see that. My colleague Sarah's ex-Youngs. She was in the lab for 3 years, I think.
Yeah.
Before she became an AB Vickers employee. So yeah, it'd be good to see it.
I'll pop it up. Whilst I remember, Andy, we got another question from Ken, who couldn't make it tonight. I'll give you the base question first of all, but there's a bit more detail behind it, which I was wondering whether might explain what happened. He wondered whether Diamond Lager, whether it ever left, or let me just take the question properly. Should he expect a small degree of diacetyl to remain even after the diacetyl rests with Diamond Lager?
Oh, wow. You're never going to eliminate it entirely, would be my response. But whether it's there within the flavour threshold or not, that's what he's really looking for. So ideally not, but that's more about kind of testing and waiting. So your yeast will eventually mop it up if it's healthy enough to a degree where it should be below the flavour threshold. But that's kind of for him to taste test. But he should expect it to go down below flavour threshold if given long enough.
Then I asked him a bit about his fermentation profile, and what he was doing was he was pitching at 18.
Okay.
And then once everything had got going, maybe a day or so, he was then taking it basically out into the shed, I think, where the temperature would drop down. Now, I don't know what to, but we sort of talked about dropping down to lagering temperatures. Would that explain, would that profile explain why the yeast might then struggle to finish off, or?
Not necessarily. With one caveat is he will meet up again after he's taking it out to the shed, because if he's not, then it would kind of explain it. So if it remains then at cold temperatures, then it's not going to mop up very well. But if he's bringing it back inside again for 4 days at warmer temperatures, then it probably will mop it up.
No, he is doing. It's exactly
okay.
What he's doing. Okay. So from your perspective, because I'd always been under the impression that starting a yeast off high and then dropping the temperature was really not a good thing for a yeast.
I mean, it won't like it very much, but it's diacetyl production is more about it's kind of amino acid production, so it's trying to produce particular amino acids, and particularly if those amino acids aren't there, then it will tend to kick out more diacetyl. So it's more likely to affect your fermentation performance, like kind of slow it down and make the yeast a bit annoyed in that sense.
Yeah.
So it might slow the fermentation and prevent diacetyl being mopped up, but in all likelihood the fermentation is going to be slow anyway if it's at a cold temperature. So I don't think it would have too much effect on it.
Okay.
I mean, from experience using Diamond in the brewery that I used to work in, we'd probably see diacetyl in spec within 3 to 4 days, but we'd leave it for 7 just to be on the safe side.
3 to 4 days into the rest, sorry, or into the
rest, yeah. So the rest would be kind of 3 to 4 days, and at the same time we'd be taking slurry off the bottom because you don't want it to be too warm and being sat on slurry. So we'd take the slurry off, let it sit at kind of 14ish for 5 to 7 days. Wait for diacetyl to be in spec, and then we chill down and go to further processing. But it used to come down quite nicely, to be honest. It wasn't ever a problem.
What kind of temperatures do you think you'd have issues? I'm just thinking of temperatures I rest at, because I tend to be fast lager fermentation profiles, so I can often end up at sort of 20 plus, and I'm resting around there. At what point should I be dumping slurry before I do a rest at that kind of temperature? Or
things like lagers, I always like to dump slurry. If you're not going to reuse it, I like to get it off as quick as possible, just because autolytic characters can set in quite quickly. And especially if you're doing quite a strong beer, if you're doing an imperial stout, quite often you get an imperial stout that just tastes of Marmite, and that for me is because it's sat on that slurry. And I would dump yeast every day in an imperial stout fermentation. Not so in a lager necessarily, but I certainly would want to sit it warm on the yeast for a 4-day diacetyl rest. I want to get it off that slurry quite quickly.
Okay, and then just trying to be a little bit not too selfish, just coming back to Ken's question. So given that that's what he's doing, where would you look for, if there were diacetyl issues, what would you look at?
So I'd probably look at 2 approaches maybe. One would be nutrition and the other would be yeast. So your yeast concentration is maybe a bit lower than where you'd like it to be. It will bring your diacetyl down more slowly, just because there's less strains in solution, less cells in solution to bring that diacetyl down. So you could up your pitching rate or wait longer, depending on what you're prepared to do. Either would probably work. And then if that doesn't work, I'd maybe look to add maybe a bit of yeast nutrient, because you might see that there's a little bit of deficiency in leucine or isoleucine, which is the 2 amino acids that it's trying to make. But in reality, brewers' worts tend not to be that deficient in nutrients. They tend to be quite good. So I think it's probably more likely to be a yeast issue than it is to be a nutrition issue.
He's doing a gram a litre.
Gram a litre. Okay. It's not like really low, and it's not really high either. So you could go higher, or you could just wait a little bit longer. I'd probably go with waiting longer would be my call. Do you know how long he's leaving for at the moment?
I think, where are we? But he didn't say how long it rested for. Yeah, he didn't say how long. Yeah, I don't know.
I would try leaving it 5 days. That would be my starting point.
Yeah.
And see where we go from there. We used to leave ours 5 days, and we'd send samples off at 3 days. And they used to come back and spec after 3 days. So we just leave it extra amount of time just to be sure. But is he getting diacetyl problems? Like, can he taste it? Or is it?
Yeah, I think you could definitely taste it. And I think he tried 2 different methods. One was a teaspoon of slurry, first generation slurry, and the second was just 5 grams a litre. Yeah, 5 grams a litre dry.
Okay, yeah, I would start with the rest being a bit longer, and then maybe if that doesn't work, move on to using a bit more yeast.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you.
I should mention actually we've got a lager yeast coming out next year at some stage, probably I think late summer, early autumn, which is going to be in collaboration with a company in Vancouver that we've been working with recently that do natural hybrids. So the farmhouse strain that we released earlier this year is a natural hybrid produced by a company called Renaissance, which is a SDA negative saison strain. But using the same technique, we're going to produce a low sulfur, low diacetyl lager strain. So that could be one for him to try out when we eventually get it.
Will it ferment at lager, sort of regular lager temperatures, or is
It should be quite temperature tolerant as well. So it should be quite happy at warmer temperatures. So kind of like the high teens. So one to look out for. I think I should maybe get some trial sampling in the sort of late spring. So if anybody fancies it, let me know. I might be able to organise some samples.
absolutely? Yeah.
That's actually my tip for 2022 is lagers and bitters. That's what's coming. It's going to be in fashion.
Again.
Again.
James, did I cover everything on Ken's issue? I thought his question was probably quite an interesting one. That given the factors and everything.
I'm sure you did. Unfortunately, I had to step away for a minute just there. So yeah, I heard the beginning of what you were asking. So yeah.
I think you covered pretty much all of it. Yeah.
Cool.
Any other questions?
Doesn't have to be about Philly Sour. It could be about anything.
I was interested in the Guinness blending, actually. I hadn't realised that that's how Guinness was made. Am I the only one who didn't realise that?
It's a secret.
Is that just the extra stout or for all Guinnesses?
No, that's the standard stout. So the standard Guinness, yeah. The foreign exporter stuff is
pale ale, make a sour, and
yeah.
the third one?
Dark malt extracts. They have the dark malt brewery. The malt extract brewery makes the colour effectively.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of the way that Diageo makes its money is it sells its dark extract to Africa, to the African entities.
So technically, is it a stout? Or a pale ale with colour?
They brew the colour.
Is it a colour with flavour? And it's not like cinema, I presume. Presumably it's a colour with flavour as well, is it?
It's probably like a homemade version of the same. So they'll have like a mash conversion vessel and allowed to sun, and then rather than doing like a boil, they'll go into evaporators and they'll create basically a dark malt extract syrup, and then they'll blend that in. And then if they're making foreign stouts, my colleague Kofi used to work in Ghana, and they used to make theirs from sorghum, I think. So they did like a sorghum pale ale, and then they blend in the dark malt extract, which they have to buy from Dublin at an expensive price.
I'm no expert on stouts, but it seems on Guinness, but it seems to be a revered drink. Is that reverence justified? Sorry, it's an open question to everyone.
Revered by whom?
Sorry?
Revered by whom?
This is just what I hear. That's what I hear. The beer drinking community, the stout drinking, the Guinness drinking community.
Yeah, probably anyone in Dublin, actually. But if you go down to Cork, they hate it, don't they? You can't even buy it in Cork. Murphy's down there.
Well, I haven't been in enough pubs since I moved here to tell you, but yeah, it might tend to get thrown in your face every now and then.
Well, whereabouts are you, Richard?
Just east of the Cork City. So,
okay.
Yeah.
What's the other one? Because there's Murphy's, there's Guinness, and there's another one.
Beamish. The other.
Beamish. I've never had Beamish. I'd quite like to try it.
It's worth it. Very low gravity, but very roasty. You know, it's in your macros, they tend to round off anything that's quite interesting. You know, the roast character tends to alienate too large a quantity of your focus group. So they just are killing that off over the decades. But Beamish still has it. So, or as we say, it's a really good wedding beer. Something that still tastes like something after 10 pints, but stop you getting in trouble with the groomsmen.
Does anybody remember Gillespie's stout, the Scottish one that came and went in the 90s? I think it is. I think it was a very old beer. And then somebody revived it. That was quite a nice stout. But that sort of came and went within a couple of 3 years and had a big advertising campaign, but kind of never really came to anything.
No.
Try again.
No, I certainly remember Beamish. Our pub used to sell it about 30 years ago. Our local prided itself in getting interesting beers in, and the landlord used to get Beamish. In fact, I think the pub was the first place to sell Stella on tap many moons ago.
And now it's brewed in Preston. Beamish, are they independent, Richard? Do you know?
Heineken.
Ah.
Yeah, they gobbled them all up.
And they've got a brewery, or is it a Heineken plant somewhere?
Well, Cork has the big Heineken plants, so it's pretty close to where I live. So yeah, it's all done there. The Heineken plant is pretty substantial brewery, right in the middle of the city, of course. But yeah, so that's where all the products come from there. And I think, well, they make it there and they store it around the corner from me. I think it's where I live is pretty much warehousing. So I think there's cider makers, there's breweries, just piles and piles of kegs stacked on top of each other. So
I have a friend who's got a distillery in Cork, Rebel City. They're doing gin at the moment.
Haven't heard of them. Yeah, I don't know the gin that much. There's been quite a few distillers have managed to put the time in to get actual whiskey making going, and then there's a ton of distilleries just packaging up someone else's spirit as well, while they bootstrap their own their own stills and doing rum and gin as well, and so they can legally sell whiskey. It's a nice booming trade.
Yeah, I think he's just done a gin at the moment, but he's going to do a rum at some point next year. So I think is there an old car plant, an old Ford plant? Is that ring a bell? Yeah, I think they're down there.
Yeah, I'd have to, I've only lived here about a year now, but a year and a half, but I think I know where that car plant would have been, probably down by the Docklands. So there's, quite a lot of industrial, I suppose, reinvention. There's a new park opened up down there, as well as quite a lot of commercial property being converted from eyesore, like heavy industrial stuff from 30 years ago into something a bit more modern and useful. So it's opens up a lot of opportunities for kind of more interesting producers.
Remind me, Andy, and you mentioned this on the co-fermentation talk. At what OG would you start recommending doing rehydrating dried yeast?
Probably into the 70s, I think. Maybe a little higher. It's into the 60s is absolutely fine. Kind of think of that as kind of a strong but reasonably normal gravity. As you get up into like the 70s and 80s, then maybe you could benefit from it. And certainly when you get up into the like silly strengths of like 100 or higher, then definitely worth rehydrating at that point. But we don't see a benefit for regular strength really from rehydrating.
And what sort of issues are you going to start seeing?
If you don't do it, probably likely to be lower than expected attenuation. So you probably lose a proportion of cells at that high gravity right at the offset. So some of them will die just from the osmotic pressure.
Yeah.
And then because there's a lower amount of total yeast cells there, you'll see a higher final attenuation. So that's probably the effect that you would see most noticeably.
Kind of like an underpitch effect, is it?
Essentially, yeah, because you effectively kill off a bunch of your cells at the start, so you see an underpitch effect.
So if you bumped up your pitch rate by 10 to 15% or something, you could sort of negate that. If it was,
certainly, yeah, you could. Yeah, I mean,
even the mid to high 70s, you could it would act as insurance.
Yeah, you could try it that way as well. So yeah, I mean, as with anything brewing, there's the means to an end, isn't it? So you can fiddle with things like that, and it'll probably make up for the cell death that you see at the start.
So I've got several out-of-date Lallemand dry yeasts in my fridge. What, other than chucking them out or using them for yeast food, should I try a starter with them and see whether it smells all right, or what would you suggest?
I was going to ask exactly the same question, Peter. Thank you.
So it very much depends on the strain. So the strains like Nottingham, for instance, we label as good for 3 years, but in reality, probably 5. It probably be okay. And the strains that are good for 3 and you'd leave them for 3, or they're good for 2 and you'd leave them for 2. So it does depend quite a lot on the strain that you've got in your fridge. If it was Nottingham, Windsor, London, I really wouldn't have too many issues about using one that was out of date, depending on how it's been stored. And if you're worried, use a starter. If it's something like a Kolsch strain or a lager strain or the New England strain, I'd say probably best to use it for yeast food. But it does depend. One of the things that kind of controls that is there's a sugar called trihalos, which yeast cells create as the sugar, which is used to prevent their cell wall from being damaged. And during the drying process, if they've got very high levels of trihalos, then they can protect themselves and they survive better. So certain strains that are good at that can last for a very long time. So yeah, it does depend on the strain, but if it's Nottingham, you probably can get away with it. If it's other strains, less so.
Right. The one I had in mind was a Kolsch. So
yeah, just don't. Sorry.
Oh well, never mind.
I have a Windsor yeast that is about to go out of date, and if you look at the calculators in terms of viability, they don't give you a viability, I don't think. So what should I assume if I want to be specific about the pitching rate?
Is it being kept in the fridge?
Yes.
Yeah, I'd probably suggest you might lose 5 to 10% of the cells over the course of that period of the 3 years. So maybe up it by 15% or something. Okay. But in all honesty, the Windsor is very robust. You could probably brew with it in 3 years' time, and you might see a poor attenuation, but you probably still see activity. So yeah, at this point, I'd probably say use it now, and then you don't have to worry about it. But
perfect. Thank you.
The Kolsch yeast was one of the yeasts that I found is most sensitive to being unhappy about being repitched after. I can't remember how strong my initial beer was, but I repitched with it afterwards, and it just fell flat on its face. It was absolutely knackered.
Yeah, it's not a good grower, so it doesn't grow to very high cell concentration, and it doesn't do very well in subsequent fermentations either. If you've had it particularly in a kind of a high strength environment, you'd probably find if you took all the slurry from like a more reasonable kind of strength beer, like a 4%, it'd probably perform all right. But yeah, if it's been in a tough environment, it probably won't like it. Colin's another one that's one of the ones that has quite a high pitching rate. So you have to get quite high at the start as well. So it's a very nice strain, but it's a bit tricky to deal with.
What's Marie's mentioned using Nottingham for lagers before. How clean is it when you go low? Like, how have you ever had a side by side with a lager yeast and Nottingham done low?
So I have it. It's very clean, almost to the point of being slightly too clean. So your lagers will tend to put out a bit of like a sulfur characteristic, which is usually absent in the Nottingham fermentation. So it tastes like a very clean ale, almost to the point of being like a lager, but it misses that sulfur component that you get from a lager yeast. So it's close, and you could definitely make something very acceptable with it, but it might miss that sort of slightly lagery, sulfury smell.
I think we're all probably familiar with the dangers of underpitching yeast, but what are the dangers with overpitching yeast?
Fairly minimal. The dangers are more associated with losses, so overflowing fermenters, high sediments, a greater autolysis if you leave it. So you've got a lot more yeast there, a lot more dead yeast there. So you can get that kind of yeasty or autolytic characteristics as well. But in terms of fermentation performance, it's not going to cause you too much of an issue. Yeah.
How soon does autolysis kick in? Because my experience is you can leave a beer on the yeast and the fermenter for many weeks, and you don't have much of a problem with autolysis.
It depends on the beer. So I wouldn't do it with a very strong one, because it will start to get grumpy quite quickly. And if you've pitched at a high rate, that sort of tend to accentuate that characteristic because you've got more of the yeast cells there. But I'd want it off like the main sediment quite soon after fermentation. Some of those flavors will clear up a bit in like in a secondary fermentation if you're doing like a bottle condition. But if you're doing let's say you're doing a beer for keg and you're carbonating it, and not doing a secondary fermentation, I'd want it off that yeast pretty quickly, to be honest.
Are you up for a curveball?
Sure, why not?
The Heineken A strain, which apparently was a very widely distributed yeast back in the day, and I'll give you fair warning. I've looked at the yeast wheel that sort of groups things in different places, and my question is there a yeast today that is derived from the Heineken A strain that's available? I couldn't see anywhere where that had lined up.
So I would need to look at the wheel, but if it's a lager yeast, they tend not to be that diverse, because their genetic history is so much shorter than your ale strains. So in all likelihood, probably. When Hansen sort of started his pure yeast method, he sent his yeast out and his yeast purification method out kind of around the whole of Europe, and most of the European lager strains tend to be kind of from those initially. So I'd be surprised if there wasn't something that was quite close to it.
There seems to be a Sats from history, a Sats strain and a Froberg strain. Most of the ones that seem to be available today, like 3470 and things like that, seem to come from the Froberg strand, but the Heineken A yeast, it seems to come from the Sat side, but doesn't. And it seems strange that if Heineken are still using it today,
big question
why that yeast isn't somewhere out there if it was so popular. It was in competition to what the Carlsberg lab were doing. From what I've been working with Ron Patterson on some historical Heineken records that we jointly delved into, and it struck me that it's strange that a yeast that was so prevalent is now not prevalent, and so that was my question, really.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it's something that I've looked into in the past as well. And that the Froberg strains very much, if you look at the modern commercially available lager strains, they dominate, and the starter side doesn't. And there's some data that I've looked at that would suggest that I think they sometimes call them type 1 and type 2. I can't remember which one's which. But one of them was thought to not be a maltotriose fermenter. So in that case, you'd probably see fairly poor attenuation. And your fermentations wouldn't be as complete. So it could be that it's sort of died out in kind of modern brewing because it doesn't give you the same degree of attenuation that the Froberg strains do. So that's kind of my thought. I've even actually trialed through records from the National Collection of Yeast Cultures to see if I can find a genuine maltotriose negative lager strain. And it's quite tricky. There's a few in there that are potentials, but I agree. Like, are they now using it or not? That's the question. Do they use that strain? If they do use it, how do they make up for the fact that it doesn't ferment maltotriose? Because having low attenuation in the brewery like that when you're making premium lagers just it's not useful. No. So are you going in with a very low mash temperature? Are you using very high enzyme content malt? Are you using enzymes to produce a more fermentable extract? I don't know. But you would need to, if you were going to use a yeast like that, to create a fully fermented premium lager. The same question sort of arose when they did the H41. Do you remember? You see that one? The H41 was a beer that they brewed using one of the ancestor strains of lager yeast. So one of the strains that was pre-hybridization. So the lager strain is a hybrid of an ale strain and a wild yeast, which is found all over the world now, but they did find it in Argentina called Saccharomyces eubayanus, and they brewed a beer using eubayanus. And the attenuation of that strain was low, but the beer that you drank wasn't sweet. It wasn't poorly fermented. So what did they do to mitigate that characteristic of the strain? Probably a low mash temperature and possibly enzymes. But yeah, finding something on the market that is an original type SARS type strain is quite tricky.
We discovered from the Heineken archive in Amsterdam, the pilot brewery records from Rotterdam from about 1935 to 1959, and I put up a YouTube video of our conversation of our initial pass at looking at that. They did end up with a fairly poorly attenuated beer, but it was lagered for a long period of time, and they were using triple decoction or double decoction. So the methods were different back in the day. So, but the question about the yeast is one of those mysteries.
It's one of those ones I'd love to play with it. It probably doesn't have much in the way of commercial potential, at least in craft brewery, because getting the high level of attenuation required would be quite tricky. But I'd be fascinated to see some data from somebody actually using it. So if you find any, I'd love to hear about it.
Well, I just thought it was an opportune moment to see whether you had bumped into it at all. So, hey.
I don't think we've got anything in the collection. So we've got the Lallemand Yeast Culture collection in Chicago. But no, I don't think we have a type. I can't remember if it's type 1 or type 2. I'm going to say type 2, but I could be wrong. But I don't think we have a type 2 lager yeast in the collection.
Yeah, interesting, because if it was that prevalent, it probably crossed the pond. Would that be the Siebel?
Yeah, it's the LYCC, so the Lallemand Yeast Culture collection is held by Siebel.
Yeah. It probably crossed the pond to the US and was probably used. So anyway.
Yeah, you would think so, and Siebel was around in those days, so yeah, you would think that they might have something within the collection. Siebel, actually, interestingly, was transformed into a baking school during Prohibition, which is the history of Siebel would be quite interesting to look at as well, I think.
Well, I not to blow my own trumpet, but I was the recipient of the Lallemand scholarship through the American Homebrewers Association 2009.
Oh, brilliant.
So I went to Chicago and went to the Siebel and did their short course.
It's gone. They've changed it. They've got a whole new premises and everything now.
The good thing about it was a short walk to Goose Island, and the Goose Island this is pre takeover. It was a short walk to the bar. Excellent.
I'm perpetually supposed to go to Chicago and see the new site, but it keeps getting cancelled because of COVID. So I'm hoping for June this year I'll get to go and drink some beers in the Stube.
Judging by the silence, that's all the questions.
Sorry, I have one other question. I'm just battling with some reason my Zoom window has disappeared and it won't come back now. But I can still hear you, so I'll ask the question anyway. It was raised, it's mentioned on our internal sort of Slack channel earlier on about Aromazyme, which now is a Lallemand product. I think we've probably asked about it before, maybe, but can you just kind of give an overview as to kind of what it's useful for, where its sort of strengths are? Because it sounds like so kind of a magic enzyme you're going to put in your beer and it's going to make it smell amazing or something.
Yeah, a lot of people would like it to be magic, but it's not, unfortunately. So the idea is it releases volatile terpenes, which would be bound to plant cell walls. So things like linalool, that could be that kind of hoppy flavour, are bound to plant cell walls by glycoside bonds, and this comes along and it cleaves those bonds and allows those volatile terpenes to then enter the beer and therefore partake in the aroma of the products. And you have quite a lot of these bound terpenes in hops, and the idea is by treating with this product you can increase your hoppiness of your product. I've done quite a lot of work recently with larger brewers where they're actually wanting to use it as a way to reduce hopping rates, and we've found that it doesn't really work too well for that, because if you reduce your hops by 30%, you're also reducing your substrate and your potential volatile terpenes by 30% as well. So it's more about flavor modification and maybe giving you like a more of a hoppy effect with the recipe that you're using than it is about reduction of hops. That doesn't seem to work that well, but it will give you kind of a modified hop flavor. It's quite complicated really, because you've got two things going on. You've got yeast releasing these volatile terpenes, but then your enzyme releasing these volatile terpenes, but then yeast can actually modify those chemicals as well. So while you're cleaving this linalool molecule, you don't actually know what's going to happen to it in the presence of yeast after that. So the effect of it is, it's not like unknown, but the chemicals that you're producing from that cleavage is it's not entirely clear. Like you will get some linalool production, but then you will probably get other downstream products which are from yeast modifying that molecule once it's been cleaved. So the effect of it is kind of, it's very hard to say exactly what it's going to do, but it should give you kind of a hoppier flavor, or give you more hoppy flavor from the hops that you're using. But I wouldn't use it for hop production, which is what a lot of people have asked me if they can do, and I actually have done trials in that regard as well, trying to drop hops from recipes.
Is the idea to add it to the fermenter?
Yes, you add it to the fermenter, yeah. So I would add it probably at the start of fermentation.
Okay, so I was going to say, like, could you say use it sort of in alongside a dry hop or after a dry hop to increase the expression of that, or?
You can add it at the same time as dry hopping. I think it's all about contact time, right? So if you've got it well distributed within the beer already, and then you dry hop, then you actually have quite a good contact time.
Okay, so it'll hang around in the beer to do its.
But you could also play around with, putting your hops in a vessel and then adding the enzyme, and having an excess of enzyme in the presence of the hops, and then adding them into the fermentation. So addition rate is quite important, and you can play around with it.
Does it have more impact with some hops than others?
Yes, absolutely, because those glycosides are far more prevalent in some hops than others. So, for instance, I have a brewery that's been using Mosaic, and actually Mosaic doesn't have that much in the way of bound terpenes. So you see less of an effect with Mosaic than you say might with another hop.
Interesting. I'll be curious to see sort of what its effect might be on some less expressive hops. By that I mean sort of the stuff like sort of British hops and things like that. So whether you can sort of get more out of it.
Yeah, no, I think that would be really interesting as well. Unfortunately, because we're not a hop company, we don't assay all the hops for their bound kind of terpene content. But I think it's something that you probably see a bit more coming from the hop guys, like the kind of analysis of the hops that work well with that sort of product. The other side of that's we call it biotransformation, that beta glycoside cleavage, and the enzyme does it, but yeast also naturally do it as well. The other side is beta glucosidase, or sorry, beta lyase activity, not beta glucosidase, beta lyase activity, and there you're releasing kind of bound sulfur molecules. So the kind of flavors that you get from Sauvignon Blanc wines, you can get from hops as well, and that's another kind of technique with another kind of form of biotransformation. So you have these volatile molecules being released by beta lyase enzymes, which are produced by yeast. So that's another side to it, which we're looking at as well. We don't have an enzyme that does that, but we've started looking at our different strains and characterizing from the level of the beta amylase enzyme that they produce and how good they are at releasing those bound sulfur molecules into solution. So that's kind of a new thing for us, and I'm hoping at some point this week I'll have a meeting with a company. Have you heard of Phantasm powder? It's like a thing that seems to be really fashionable among some of the craft brewers, at least in the States. And it sounds like something pretty dodgy that you buy in a dodgy shop, but it's basically a dried extract of grape skins, which contains very high levels of these bound sulfur molecules. So using that powder in conjunction with the yeast that has good beta lyase release activity can give you a really high level of these sort of Sauvignon Blanc type characteristics. So that's a kind of an area that I'm looking at the moment.
Interesting.
I used it, Aromazyme, in that triple IPA I did, and apart from a very small dash of Ella and Citra, most of the hops in that were Cascade and Centennial, and I thought it. I don't know whether it increased I wouldn't say the aroma was necessarily increased, although I know baseline it was a weird beer to choose anyway for doing that. But I definitely thought some of the aromas and the flavors were more tropical than I would ever have expected from those tiny additions. Does it modify the?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because I've done quite a lot of work with a really big brewing recently, and one of the things that frustrates them is that they always pick up the Aromazyme addition on sensory, so they can always get it. They always know it's being used, and they get a more hoppy flavor. But they're looking for chemical markers, so they're looking for what's causing the extra hoppy flavor, and they can't work it out. So they know that the fingerprint of the hop characteristic must have changed because of the enzyme addition. But in order for them to roll it out at the larger scale, they need more than just the sensory data. They need a definite increase in something, and they can't prove it. So they've got a product that always comes out better on sensory panel, but they can't prove why, so they can't roll it out any further. It's a bit of a strange one.
They can't measure more linalool or geraniol or whatever they're looking
Exactly.
for.
All the ones that are obvious, they measure them and they're like, oh, it's not that, it can't be that, the increase isn't enough. So what is it?
Yeah.
And that's the tricky bit.
Cool. Thank you.
suppose you could do a nice side by side with that, couldn't you? You could split the same beer with 2 fermenters, couldn't you? And use a very old school or something very, you know, quite a recognizable hop, do a simple pale ale or whatever, and side, that'd be nice.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a funny process by a transformation because it's so complicated that I don't think we'll ever necessarily be able to nail down all the pathways and give like a definite answer. So we can only say what the enzyme does, and then, you know, after that it's kind of for the brewer to decide. I tend to tell people that they should use it as a tool in their recipe production rather than a way of, you know, taking things out and making it taste the same or better, because I don't think it works in that application particularly well, because it's very hard to say what it's changed. But
I think that's very interesting though, that the panels can tell every time when it's been used. I think that's
says a lot for taste panels, doesn't it? It does.
Was that the last question, James?
Cool. Anyone else? Speak now. That was awesome. Thank you for coming again, Andrew.
That's right, no problem. Yeah, it's nice to be here. I can't go anywhere either, so you know.
Yeah.
It's good. We should do this more often.
We're here every month.
Yeah.
No, I definitely want to try the sour pitch.
Thanks very much.
Yeah,
What types of sours are most commercials using it for? You know, is it just straightforward like American style sours? Or
Yeah, to be honest, most of them are fruit forward American style, relatively low strength sours. That seems to be like pretty much that's what everybody's doing. So whether it's raspberries or peach or whatever, it's always like a fruit based, fairly low strength, 4 to 5% straight up sour. That's what I see.
Gooses or
some as well, but less so. You know, there's some out there, but I think it's about making a sour beer as accessible as possible, right? So you make it sour but fruity and just easy drinking.
yeah.
I made a red currant sour this year with the Philly sour and with homegrown red currants, and that was very nice. But it was very. I think I failed to take into account the tartness of the red currants. I don't really, not really had that many sour beers, but I am enjoying it, I have to say. So I was pretty impressed with the Philly sour yeast.
Did the tannicness of the red currants come across, or was it quite?
It's definitely changed over time. Something else I'd forgotten to take into account was I think that red currants have a lot of pectin, and so it's very, very hazy to start with, but it's dropped really, really well. Because I only looked at red currants really because what can you do with them other than make jelly? I've made wine, and they're kind of a bit too tart to use for much else.
Ice cream. They make awesome ice cream.
Oh, do they?
Strawberry and red currant ice cream.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for that. But yeah, maybe next year if I make it again, I might take a reading of the pH level of the red currants to see what try and balance it out a bit. But yeah, I was impressed with the Philly sour yeast.
Yeah, I've got like a couple of kilos of red currants in the freezer, and I've been trying to think of a beer to use with them for about 12 months. So yeah, that sounds like something I might give a go.
Oisin. Good night, Oisin. Have you picked a nice big story from Emma?
Good night.
Mine went to bed at 6 today. I think I've done quite well, really.
Wow.
It's good. How did you do that?
No, well, she's only 18 months old, but she doesn't really sleep at nursery, so she does. She's just exhausted when she gets home.
They come in, pass out.
Who's gonna read a story?
Want Daddy to read?
No, me too.
I went with a dipper for the meeting today, which was
Have you been good with Mommy?
Oh, nice.
it was quite good actually. It's I managed to, but before the whole world ended again, I managed to get out to Sweden. So it's from a brewery called Duck Pond in Gothenburg. So,
Up you go.
nice.
I like the name.
It's owned by a semi-famous guy. He had a band called Melancholy, which I'd never heard of, but somebody here might have done. No, they're kind of like skateboard, surf rock. You kind of expect to see them on like a Tony Hawk's PlayStation 2 game or something.
Apart from
Nice
being
beers,
very,
though.
apart from being very expensive, what's the brewing scene like in Sweden?
Yeah, quite good actually. Yeah, no, I was pleasantly surprised. We went around 6 or 7 breweries around Gothenburg, all like a decent size. Nice equipment, centrifuges, stainless steel tanks, you know, that sort of thing. No, it seemed like a fairly kind of happening industry, as you say, quite expensive, and they all have to work within the limits of the government monopoly. So they have to, you know, that it's a bit of a struggle to sell small pack. Well, you just have to sell it through the monopoly. But other than that, no, it seems to be reasonably buoyant.
Sorry, what does that mean, the government monopoly?
So all the off licenses are owned by the government. So all your beer has to be sold to the government.
Oh.
So there's advantages and disadvantages in it. They pay up front, and they'll ring you every now and then and say, I want this particular beer. But then you also have to like win listings. You kind of have to compete with other brews to get listings in the government off license. So it's actually quite a common system around the world, especially like the Nordics. They're quite big on it. And then Canada and I think Canada, maybe the US as well. Canada, India, lots of places have it. So all the
Canada have it, but they're odd because they do it by provinces as well.
BC have it, right? But I don't know
BC had
about
it. Yeah, I lived there for a year, and it was horrifically expensive trying to buy beer, and very tight rules.
In theory, the Swedish one is meant to be not for profit, so they should be selling beer at their cost, but it still somehow manages to be really expensive.
So the reason for this is to control the market, to reap the taxes. I presume. What is their view, therefore, about the homebrew scene?
A good question. I mean, the homebrew scene is quite popular, and I think that's mainly a cost issue, in that the beer is so expensive that making your own is. But they seem to be fine with like allowing it. It's not a problem. Depending on where you are, home brewing can be home distilling can be extremely illegal. So in Norway, for instance, it's like, you know, if you get caught home distilling, they'll take away your stuff. They'll give you a massive fine. You might be looking at a custodial sentence. Whereas, I mean, in the UK, you sort of like, as long as nobody sees you do it and you aren't selling it, probably going to be fine. So they're strict on some things. It's quite a different sort of distribution model to what we've got here.
In the Nordic countries, aren't the off licenses open at really inconvenient times, like 9 to 5, Monday to Friday? So you can't get a beer on late on a Saturday even.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Yeah, I mean, I didn't actually go to one, so my knowledge is limited. But I think that they are quite restricted. They're not open in the evenings and stuff. I remember.
So I have a friend in.
Oh, go on.
I have a friend in Norway, where I think it's even more expensive than in Sweden, and the reason is to discourage alcoholism, but in reality, it doesn't really work like that.
I remember how shocked I was when I went to university in Scotland and you couldn't buy beer in off license after 10 o'clock at night. That was a total
really?
revelation to me. Yeah. Yeah.
At a time when you needed it most, probably as well.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, what?
Everyone I know from the Nordic countries drinks more. It's just spirits instead.
I was on a flight between Helsinki and Stockholm, and I was working, so it was up the pointy end, and and it's only a really short flight, and they brought these little trays out, and they're sculling spirits like it's going out of style. I'm going, what? This was 9 o'clock in the morning, something like that. And I thought, oh. The thing I remember about, I can't pronounce it, but it reads like System Boggling or something like that.
Yeah, that's what it's called.
Yeah, and all the beer was everything was not refrigerated, just sitting on the floor. But in Sweden, at least in Stockholm, this is a few years ago, quite a good selection. There was stuff from Australia, New Zealand, UK, lots of Belgian beers. I got quite a good selection to take back to my hotel and put in the fridge. So yeah, but yeah, it's a bit of a weird system.
Yeah, it didn't translate well. It just was very different to how we do it here. But yeah, it does seem like a slightly odd one. They also have quite a lot of stipulations around packaging. So you pay quite a hefty deposit to list your container, and then you have to kind of recycle it and stuff. So he gave me, the brewer that I went to, gave me a couple of beers that were they weren't released yet, and he was like, you can't recycle these yet, because if you recycle them before they're officially listed, I'll get in trouble. So he was like, you have to hang on to these until they're listed with the recycling system.
And they also don't regard a 3.5% ABV beer as being alcoholic. So you can buy a porter, a Carnegie porter at 3.5% in the grocery store. If you want to have the full strength one, you have to get it from the offie. So every country's got weird things.
That's the total opposite of here, where if you go to Lidl's and buy their 0% Bavaria lager, they still have to come and check that you're over 25. I always get checked. I always have to get a cashier coming up, and it's 0%. And I point it out every time. It says 0%. You know, it's not got any alcohol in it, but they still have to check it.
I had that in Sainsbury's with a non-alcoholic wine, and they said, well, it's flagged on our system.
Just be grateful they're still asking you.
Well, there is that.
Because apparently some states in the US, you also have to have your label approved by the local alcohol and tobacco board, and you can get into quite big trouble for having a racy label or you're calling your beer something that's a little bit suggestive.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much most states in the US.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It's the same here, isn't it? You can't these days have anything that's sexist, and there are very tight rules about what you must include on your label. I think it's fairly standard.
Well, I don't know about what you must include. That's down to the local environmental health and trading standards people. Like in Luton, when I was doing mine, they were like, tell us what the ABV is. That'll do. In Luton, yeah, they were really non-prescriptive, whereas I know some people, like a friend of mine in Cambridge, they were like, you must have this. Yeah, there was very stark differences. Yeah, I mean, I put allergens on just because, but yeah, they didn't insist on it, which was, I thought, a bit weird.
I think the label design is it's industry self-regulated by the Portland Group, isn't it? Which are
yeah.
Well, thanks, Andrew. Very interesting talk. It's breakfast time here, so I'll bid you a good night and catch you later.
Happy Christmas.
Let us know how the stout goes.
Christmas. Bye. Thank you.
There's enthusiasm for you. A guy who gets up whatever time in the morning just to attend one of our meetings. Very impressive.
Yeah, 4:35 a.m. That's mad.
Yeah, what if they minus 13 hours or something?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just outside Sydney.
We usually exclude the Australians from our company meetings just because they're only awake at inconvenient time.